Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our book salon for Harassed, Genders, Bodies, and Ethnographic Research. This is a panel organized for the American Sociological Association annual meeting, which has had to move virtual. So we are running this through the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at the University of Chicago with the sponsorship of the Chicago Ethnography Incubator. So we're so excited that you could join us, and I really want to thank all of our participants for being able to join us in the summer. We really appreciate you. We are recording this because we will provide a link to the ASA and it will be made available to people who participate in the virtual conference. I'm Kristen Schiltz. I am a professor at the University of Chicago and the director for the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality here. And I'm going to do some introductions. So I'm going to introduce our panelists first. We have Patricia Richards, who is a professor of sociology and women's studies at the University of Georgia. We have Rebecca Hanson, who is an assistant professor at the Center for Latin American Studies and the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Florida. And Patricia and Rebecca are the authors of the book we'll be discussing today. Our discussants are Sneha Annavarapu, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Chicago, who will soon be on Friday a postdoctoral scholar. So we have Annie Hikido, who is an assistant professor at Colby College in sociology. And we have Brandon Andrew Robinson, who is an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies at UC Riverside. Tiana Paschel at UC Berkeley was unable to join us today, but sends regards. The structure is going to be Sneha will give us an introduction of the book. We'll have comments from Sneha, Annie, and Brandon. The authors will get to offer some comments, and then we will open up for a Q&A. There's a Q&A tab. You can put your questions in there, and the panelists will be able to see them. So thank you very much. We're very excited. We imagine that the discussing part will go on for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So thank you all for joining us, and I will hand this over to Sneha.
Hi, Kristen. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. I'm so excited to be here. And, you know, it really is such an honor and such a pleasure to be introducing a book that has given me goosebumps on many an occasion. Kristen Schiltz first gave me the book back in 2019, and I remember devouring it in a couple of sittings, because the book really warrants no other form of engagement. For a book that grapples with very complex and difficult questions, it is startlingly lucid. Every page resonated with me. I've said this to Rebecca and Patricia before, but Harassed is a book that I have, for the lack of a better word, bullied people into buying and reading. The reason really is quite simple, personal and political at once. This book talks about an issue, gender and fieldwork, that has not been brought up very often when we study sociological methods. Sure, I was told that gender, along with factors such as race, class, caste, religion, sexuality, matter during fieldwork, but what does one do with such knowledge? It is one thing to acknowledge one's social position in abstract, albeit relational social space, but how much should I, as an ethnographer, write about this? Should I think of my social position like a sieve through which my data is being filtered? Or should I think of my body and my biography as if they were the shaky hands of a novice potter, crafting my fieldwork and data intimately and inimitably? And most troublingly, would talking about my gender reinforce some sort of stereotype around women researchers? Most fundamentally, why does such a stereotype even exist? And why don't men talk about their gender during fieldwork more often? Many of us are often clueless as to how and how much gender matters to the way we do fieldwork, to the way we write research, to the kinds of arguments we construct, or quite simply what we consider good data and by extension, good sociology. I started fieldwork in 2017 and realized very quickly that I would have to confront these questions, though for the longest time, I was very reluctant to, because my project isn't really about gender, if one can even make such claims. For those who don't know, I did ethnographic research amongst cab drivers, tuk-tuk drivers, and traffic policemen in the Indian city of Hyderabad, and spent a lot of time, as I often joke, gallivanting on the streets. I was trying to understand state-citizen relations through the prism of traffic regulation. My project about social disciplining and state authority, I thought, had nothing to do with gender. Neither was I thinking about violence or danger per se. I was not researching gang violence, homicides, or sexual crimes. I was not unearthing state secrets of troubling proportions. However, considering India's atrocious tryst with women's safety, my project was immediately and instinctively considered a risky one by my friends and family, and even some of my interlocutors. After all, I was a woman researcher in very masculine spaces, and as you can imagine, I had several encounters that reinforced the risks that I was undertaking as a woman ethnographer. I often caught myself thinking about my gender as a disadvantage and wondered if I was not better off doing something else altogether. One professor even told me that a male student would have been able to do a better job with my kind of a dissertation because they would be able to hang out with their interlocutors without worrying about the sexual dangers in this bad, bad world. But I did what I could. The first time a tuk-tuk driver asked me to have sex with him during an interview, I did what we do best. I wrote a reflective essay about it. As such, my field notes were brimming with thoughts about being confronted with the sexualized other, and no methodology training had prepared me for these moments. I relied on my gut to get out of these situations unscathed, and I even used gendered presumptions around my innocence and naivety to my advantage. These moments, I have to admit, made me very proud. I felt like I was doing good ethnography by putting myself out there. After all, isn't danger crucial to ethnographic brilliance? Was I not proving my mettle by shouldering these risks? All that juicy data atop slippery, slippery slopes. And yet, the dissertation I'm defending in a couple of days does not talk about any of these moments. Neither my real anxiety at being harassed, nor my self-declared heroism. Some of it is relegated to the methodological appendix, but much of my dissertation reads as if my hand was never kissed by a police constable who was merely trying to, in his cheeky words, imitate American culture. My dissertation reads as if I did not put myself in very shaky situations just to sit in on high-profile meetings. These moments became what Patricia and Rebecca call surplus data, the kind of data that one often does not know what to do. I have been carefully socialized into writing despite my gender, procuring data despite the disadvantages of my body. Harassed gets at precisely these audible silences that emerge as difficult dilemmas during gender fieldwork and sociological inquiry. Drawing on interviews with qualitative researchers, Harassed discusses the experiences of women and men in their ethnographic journeys and how their gender identity shaped what they were able to do and how it made them feel. It centers how gender shapes fieldwork and sociological thought, instead of making gender and sexuality variables that one need to cursorily account for. The book sheds light on the kinds of physical, psychological, and emotional costs that our fellow ethnographers have paid while doing projects that are just vexing to do, not just because of their gender identities, but also because there has been no space in academia to discuss these issues. The androcentric, racialized, and colonialist history of qualitative methods that has developed within the academy has made discussions of the body taboo in ethnographic narratives, which contributes to the silence surrounding sexual harassment in academia itself. This book speaks for those who have remained silent and who have been silenced. As I read this book, I saw myself in the narratives of those who abandoned their projects or just simply changed them because the harassment in the field was becoming untenable. Those who blamed themselves for their ethnography being difficult. Those who felt like their data collecting was not valuable enough or not legitimate enough. To go back to my own tryst with writing a dissertation, it was when I read this book that I realized that not only was my understanding of what ethnographic brilliance is shaped by certain fixations, but that these fixations were deeply gendered and pointed to a prevalent masculinist ethic. The book points out that these three fixations are solitude, danger, and intimacy. In short, Harassed is a critical analysis of why we consider certain kinds of data, certain forms of ethnographic writing more valuable, and what the gendered histories of such valuations even are. The book shows how intertwined fieldwork is with socialization processes within academia and the pressures and expectations that we face as we try to publish, get jobs, and establish ourselves as legitimate experts. The book is also prescriptive. It argues for an embodied approach to ethnography that reflexively engages with the ways in which our bodies shape the worlds we inhabit. Each chapter comes with several little exercises that facilitate a rewriting and a rethinking of data. The book does not just advocate for writing with the body, but really shows us how it can be done through examples and practical exercises. Show, don't tell, am I right? Harassed provides us not just with critiques, but also alternatives, a real feat for an academic book. For that reason, I find it incredibly useful to teach with, and I'm so excited to use this in the coming year. To conclude, I must admit that even though I read the book, I could not retrace my steps into writing the kind of embodied ethnography that the book discusses. To me, my own difficulty in doing so simply points to how deeply entrenched ideas around writing without a body are, at least in sociology. But the fact that I have several chapter drafts that write using an alternative version, that write with my body, points to how this book is a success in making me think differently, in making me imagine differently. And to me, really, this has been the most useful contribution of the book. It is not simply a provocation, it is a prescription. It is not simply an indictment, it is also an imaginary. In all, Rebecca and Patricia, thank you so much for this wonderful book. I cannot emphasize how critical a contribution this is to the world of ethnographic writing. And I think I will hand it over to Annie and Brandon now to let us know their thoughts. I'm sure they're wonderful.
Would you like to go, Annie, or like me to go? I'm unmuted, so I'll just go. I'm gonna keep my comments brief, as I'm very interested in having a discussion among all of us, and I'm also interested in the questions from the attendees, especially the grad students who are here, to see how they're thinking about this book and their own work. So thank you both for writing such a wonderful and important book. This book should be taught in all methods courses in our discipline, and indeed, I have already sent it to the professors in my department who teach our feminist research methods class. As I'm in a gender studies department, our methods classes are inherently feminist. But the stories are powerful. The interventions have been needed for a long time. And I do hope this book can transform how we do research and shift how we construct knowledge. The opening of chapter 4 on the cost that sexual harassment has on ethnographers really drove home for me the importance of this book. And the first 2 sentences really made me stop and digest the power of sexual harassment and violence. As Rebecca and Patricia write, quotes, "Objectification, sexual harassment, and abuse are part of the fabric of women's socialization." I want to repeat that first part because I think it's so important for all of us to hear. Objectification, sexual harassment, and abuse are part of the fabric of women's socialization. And violence against women and the expectation that women endure it is normalized at a young age. Though normalized sexual harassment has long-term effects on women's emotional well-being, shapes their interactional strategies, and restricts their ability to feel safe in public places and thrive in educational and work settings, end quotes. Wow. Violence and sexual harassment constitutes being a woman and how women experience the social world. Or to be a woman basically means that you are going to experience sexual harassment throughout your entire life. This statement made me think of Gail Mason's book, The Spectacle of Violence, which I think everyone should read. And in the Spectacle of Violence, she looks at how violence is productive and produces people. And she's specifically looking at violence against lesbians and how violence against lesbians marks lesbians as other, marks them as disgusting, and how violence itself produces lesbianism. And that we cannot understand the category of lesbian outside of violence. And I think this is true for the category of woman in general, that we cannot understand this category outside of the experience of violence and specifically outside of the experience of sexual harassment. But as Patricia and Rebecca show, if sexual harassment is a quotidian experience of women's lives and part of being a woman, then how does that shape ethnographic fieldwork and how women ethnographers experience the field and write and produce knowledge? I deeply appreciate that Rebecca and Patricia locate the problem within academia itself, and that sexual harassment isn't something that's out there in the field, that we're not pathologizing the global South as somehow harassing us, or somehow poor communities or Black and brown communities, but this is happening in academia itself, and it's the structure of academia that's kind of masking over and ignoring the role of sexual harassment in ethnographers' lives, and specifically women ethnographers' lives. So sexual harassment structures academia, and as they show in the book, the colonialist, white, androcentric way of doing ethnography hides over how sexual harassment occurs both in the field, but also in our academic communities and how we write and do ethnography. I love then the concept of embodied reflexivity that the authors propose as a way to intervene in the erasure of sexual harassment in the field. Indeed, I actually often hate how we write about reflexivity currently, and I try to get my grad students not to do it that way. That we often say, because I'm a white researcher, I think being white did this when I interacted with white people and did this when I interacted with people of color, or because of my gender is this, I think it did this when I interacted with women, or this when I interacted with non-binary people. And indeed, the way we write about reflexivity to me is absurd because it essentializes these categories of race, class, gender, and sexuality and makes them static. Even though we should know by now that race, gender, sexuality, and class, we know are shaped by context, by interactions, and by our embodiments. And so indeed, you know, how my gender operates in the field might be different based on who I'm interacting with, the contact that I'm interacting with, or even the same person who I'm interacting with the first time versus a year to 2 years later. But often we don't get at that in how we write about reflexivity in our work. I believe then that embodied reflexivity pushes us then in a very crucial way to really capture how categories operate in our field sites on the interactional, contextual, and embodied levels in the problematic way that we do it now. It can really get at helping us to understand our field site and who we're studying better if we engage in this practice. So now for my question. So for me, this book raised much larger questions for me about the field of sociology and about the method of ethnography. So for me, this book still seemed deeply invested, despite their critiques, in sociology, ethnography, and the concept of validity. Rebecca and Patricia argued several times that embodied ethnography would give us better validity than the current way we do ethnography. And yes, I agree. Embodied ethnography would be a much better way of doing research than the current colonialist, white, androcentric way of doing ethnography. I just kept wondering though, why are we even invested in the concept of validity? And isn't validity itself a potential colonialist, white, androcentric concept? In the end of the book and in the podcast that I listened to, they also called for an anti-racist feminist ethnography. But what exactly does that even mean? And what does an anti-racist feminist ethnography look like? Or is ethnography inherently colonial and racist? And if ethnography is inherently colonial and racist, do we want to reform it? Can we even decolonize ethnography? Or should we work to end the practice of ethnography and instead envision and develop new methods that are inherently feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial? Likewise, part of the problem also seems to stem from sociology itself and its investment in wanting to be a social science with emphasis on science. Therefore, I often wondered many times while reading the book, and almost every chapter, I'm like, I think the problem is sociology, if we should also do away with sociology or disciplines in general. Indeed, I think the solutions proposed in this book seem to move us towards more interdisciplinary approaches in thinking about research. But if we become more interdisciplinary, which I think we should, then do we even need disciplines? And is perhaps the main problem is that sociology still wants to invest in being a science, and hence sociology still wants to invest in being colonialist, white, and androcentric way of producing knowledge. So should we undo sociology? Ultimately, this book has pushed me to think much more broadly. And how can we reimagine academia, research, disciplines, and methods that center and are truly feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial? Is reforming ethnography the solution, or should we find new ways of knowing and producing knowledge that are grounded in feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial practices? Thanks.
Hi, I'd like to just echo Brandon and just say thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I was thinking about how one of the ethnographic fixations that Patricia and Rebecca are trying to challenge is isolation in the academy, whether it's in the field or in the halls. And so even though we're meeting virtually, this is still sort of a challenge to that isolation and creating a space where we can really collectively discuss ethnography, and I'm really grateful to be a part of it. So Sneha had asked us a few questions beforehand about how we read this book and what it meant to us. And just for those of you who don't know me, I graduated from UC Santa Barbara last year, and I'm finishing up my first year as an assistant professor at Colby College in the Sociology department. And so I read it both as really a reflection upon my own dissertation work that is now a book project, as well as a teacher, because I do teach qualitative methods at Colby. And I think those are the two main ways that people will read this book, both as educators, students, and mentors is a big one in the book. And I think that's really important. So I think you kind of have to read the book through the lens of your own project. I think it stays general so you can actually, as a reader, particularize each situation in your case as a project. So if people will bear with me, I'm actually going to talk about my project a little bit more specifically so you can kind of grasp what you might get out of it and how I got a lot out of it. So my project is based in Cape Town, South Africa. I work with Black women in these Black townships who have turned their homes into sort of tourist guest houses and bed and breakfast for mainly white European tourists. And so if you had to classify me, I'm an urban ethnographer of race, class, gender, and globalization, specifically thinking about how these symbolic interactions on the ground are reflective and constitutive of greater global processes. So the Black townships are similar to US quote unquote ghettos, are like very stigmatized. One of the first things I was often told when I pitched this project to my friends in South Africa were like, you cannot do this project. Particularly as a younger woman, it is not safe for you to go there. I would really think twice. I mean, I was going back over my field notes and I have conversations that go something like, you know, you're going to get raped. You cannot be out here. Your life is more important than your research, da, da, da. And so that was kind of how I stepped into this project. But I think why I really wanted to pursue it is because so much of urban ethnography is masculine. And I really wanted to think about what are feminine spaces like in these urban places we tend to masculinize. There's always someone studying democracy and violence at South Africa at any time. Like what more can be said about these spaces? Because I think that focus really erases the woman. So I really came in with that intent to kind of go through and do that. One thing the book really made me appreciate is that my advisor was great. I think she does a lot of the things that Rebecca and Patricia really advocate, one of them being your emotions are valid data. Brandon was critiquing the word valid, but you know, your emotions are data. They should go in your field notes, if not your actual written product. And indeed, a lot of my field notes are sort of talking about, I'm not sure about this. I'm a little scared. I don't know what to do, da, 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 da. And eventually that did become not just therapeutically useful, but analytically useful. I didn't know at the time, but eventually an entire chapter I wrote would be about the construction of perceptions of safety among white people or tourists in these sort of stigmatized Black spaces. And I never would have thought about that had I not written all the time about how I was feeling safe or unsafe, or how other people were talking and looking safe or unsafe. So really, to repeat, yeah, treating emotions as really valid data, I think, was a big takeaway that, again, my advisor was on it with that one, and that's really great. Another thing I think my advisor did that you advocate is that, you know, you can take breaks in the field. I think sometimes we don't get told that as young etnographers. There's this idea that you have to go 100% and, you know, you're out there to get your quote unquote good data. And I think she saw that in me and that sort of intensity. And she had said to me, you know, Annie, it's okay if you're living in a township to go back to the city for a week at a time. Just collect yourself, write up your field notes, use the Wi-Fi. I didn't have Wi-Fi most of the time in the townships. And so I really appreciated hearing that. And sort of what was kind of funny, though, is that I realized in sort of excavating my years doing this project as I was reading the book that despite the fact that I had a lot of support to take these breaks and you know, really reflect on all this, I think another thing that really resonated with me from the book is this narrative that, you know, you have to just pummel through, whether it's in the field or in the campus that you're in the department. There were so many challenges, and I never even let myself recognize them because there was this real push in me that I just really wanted to do a good job. Whatever harassment or sort of discouragement or whatever I faced, I sucked it up, as I think you put it in the book. And again, I had people, it was not the case where I was, I felt shame to not do that. I had a very supportive committee and people, but there was just something behind me where I just really, really wanted to do a good job. And so reading the book really made me think twice about, maybe I needed to think about that again. And actually, one of my concerns I now have is that you advocate for writing honestly about your embodied research. And I have a methodological appendix where I write a lot about these things. And as I was thinking about it, I was wondering, if someone read this, I might be reproducing the fixation of intimacy. There's this thing about, we need to make intimate relationships to get really good data. And in my case, that was really true. I mean, I think it's hard for me to let go of that fixation of intimacy because it was only through these very, very deep relationships that I developed really over 6 years that I got to know a lot of the women in my project, as well as sort of these really hidden aspects of the market. I think when I was thinking about the cost, there were times when we want to tell researchers it's okay if you don't want to research men, if you're not feeling safe, and I totally agree with that. But my knee-jerk reaction was a little bit like, oh my God, but that data, like, what are you missing when you don't get to interview the men? And so I think it's such an important book because it faced me to confront where I agree in theory, but in the lens of my project, I was like, I don't know if I'm ready to give up that data and like not do it 150% because that's what really propelled me through the 6 years. That's all to say, I think the fact that I am, sort of conflicted and thinking about it now, also as a teacher, I don't have grad students at Colby, I only have undergrads, but and a mentor for the honors thesis students, let's say, all of those sort of contradictions that inhere in my sort of doubts are really productive, I think. So thank you so much. I think Brandon had some good questions, so maybe I'll throw mine out and we can come back to it whenever. I just had one sort of point, and I think the attention to intersectionality I thought was very good and deserved. Of course, women are often experiencing different types of harassment, but you would point out how if it was a Black woman, a Latina woman, or an Asian woman, then it's often a particular type of harassment. Either it's particularized or maybe it's even augmented in some ways for that sort of harassment. And I think it's absolutely true. I also sort of wanted to think about how when we think about intersectionality, specifically of race and gender, there is that particular victimization, but I think that locus of intersection is also an opportunity for thinking about resilience, because there's a long, long history of women of color being able to mobilize that sort of anger. And I was actually reflecting on one of my favorite Audre Lorde quotes that made me think of this, and I believe it's in a 1981 essay, and she's talking about sort of the uses of anger. And the quote is, women of color in America live in a symphony of anger, and we can, include harassment in that. But it's a symphony and not a cacophony because we have learned to mobilize those furies, conduct those furies so they do not tear us apart. And I think that quote really, when I think about the ways I dealt with my various sorts of harassment in the field work, I don't want to deny it and dismiss it because it's important to realize what it was, but there were strategies I had to really make sure it didn't make me feel small, or some of the things your participants talked about. And they're sort of specific and I can come back to my strategies later. But I think remembering that the intersectionality of victimization is also the intersectionality of resilience and these ways of sort of managing your situation and moving forward productively. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Well, Becca, I guess it's our turn, first of all, to say thank you all so much for those very generous comments. And it's so great for me, I'll let Becca speak for herself, just to hear, people say, and all these amazing up and coming scholars say that our book was meaningful to them in some way, and that we're on to something. So Becca, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah. Yes, I just want to, well, first I want to thank everyone so much for being here and for reading the book and for the comments. It really is, I don't think that there's probably a better word for it than just like incredibly overwhelming. I think partially because we talked for so long with this project about what we hoped it would do. And it's just really, I'm not going to cry about it, but it's really, it's just really amazing to hear that we actually accomplished some of those things, particularly as academics it's always unclear as to whether or not the work that you're doing is going to have some kind of impact. So it's just amazing and wonderful. And it's really is just like such an honor to have people here willing to discuss what we wrote. So thank you so much. So I think that the way that we had talked about maybe kind of using a little bit of time before we get into the Q&A is to speak a little bit about kind of like the origins of the book and where the idea came from, because I think it can potentially, well, it tells you a lot kind of about what the book is about, I suppose. And also I think connects to a lot of what everyone, thank you so much, Sneha and Annie and Brandon, what you guys were talking about. So I'll talk about that just really briefly, and then I might try to respond to maybe one of the questions. I don't know if we should respond to questions right now, if we should do some.
I think Kristen was going to shoot it back to Sneha, and then we'll answer Brandon's question along with a follow-up that Sneha wanted to ask.
Okay.
I also want to respond to Annie's observation as well.
Okay. So I'll just do a really quick overview then, I guess, and then we can we'll see. I would love to hear what Sneha's question. So, yeah. So I mean, when everyone was talking and about their experiences and how this book resonated with them, it was really wonderful to hear, because I think a lot of what everyone was saying has so much to do with why we wrote the book. So just very briefly, my main quote unquote area of research is policing in Latin America. So my dissertation research project was 2-year ethnography and other qualitative methods, largely working with police officers in Venezuela, but also people who are working in other state security institutions. And so I went into the field having read women's work who had also done research with the police, and they, in some parts of their method section or an appendix, there would be a couple of sentences that would talk about sexual harassment or dealing with men as a woman in incredibly, that Sneha was saying, in incredibly masculinized spaces. I did an entire specialization in qualitative methods. I had a wonderful committee, and yet at no point during my training or during conversations with my committee had the issue of sexual harassment come up, which is, I think, Sneha, you mentioned friends and family being worried about you given your research topic, and it's because, like, yes, these issues, like these threats are so obvious, they're so blatant, and yet they're so not discussed, or at least we're not in my methods training and with other ethnographers. So that issue is, or that paradox is kind of one of the questions that drove our interest in writing the book. I spent about, I think, 6 months in the field without saying anything to anyone, largely after experiencing incredibly consistent harassment. It was so constitutive of all of the relationships that I had, almost all of the relationships that I had with my research participants in the field. And I didn't say anything to anyone because of these reasons that our wonderful discussants have already mentioned, which is that it just makes you feel like a bad researcher. I just kept telling myself, certainly someone else could be doing this research better than I am, and they wouldn't be dealing with these issues that I'm dealing with. Certainly there's something that I'm doing wrong. I did make a really quick joke about what I was dealing with to another faculty and just kind of like laughed it off, because I didn't want it to, wanted to like mention it, but just like get it over really quickly and then move on to something else. But then when I mentioned it to Patricia, when we were talking about how my research was going, she was like, oh my gosh, we have to stop and talk about this. Like, this is insane. And so that kind of like led to a discussion of what was going on in my field site, but then also reflecting on, as a feminist ethnographer herself, and as a feminist researcher, having taught feminist methods, why the issue of sexual harassment and sexualization and objectification had never come up in my committee meetings with her and with other people who were on my committee. So what was kind of driving this silence around something that she had experienced herself in the field, that I was experiencing and had kind of known about, that was incredibly, we use this quote at the beginning of the book from Gary Fine about how sexual harassment is just this like thing that has to be accepted for women who are doing research, which is both very true on the one hand and also just very problematic on the other hand, because it's just like, well, this is something that you're going to have to deal with. Now we've had that conversation, we're going to put it aside and we don't have to deal with it anymore. So we were just really interested in what was driving that silence. So we started to think about, well, we'll maybe write an article about our experiences with sexual harassment in the field. And then that slowly evolved into, well, we'll do a couple of interviews to kind of see what other people's experiences with this have been. And this is partially driven by, I think, Brandon, one of the things that you mentioned, that a desire to not have this be a book about to getting us who were being sexualized and sexually harassed by this like stereotypical Latino man or something like that, right? So we thought about doing a couple of interviews and just really all of the outpouring of interest and people's desire to talk about this project kind of like pushed us forward into doing many more interviews than we had originally planned on, and then eventually it becoming a book. And I mean, I think specifically because the question driving the book is not, as people were saying, is not about what's going on in our field side, but what's going on in academia that's keeping us from talking about something that's so incredibly obvious and blatant on the one hand, and so incredibly ignored on the other. I don't know if you want to add something to that, Patricia.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add that I think one of the things that we discovered in that initial conversation, in addition to just the way, you know, recognizing the ways in which we as members of Becca's committee had really, you know, contributed to this silencing unintentionally. Another thing that really came forth in that initial conversation was that Becca's approach to harassment in the field had been to pummel on through, as Annie said. And what I realized was that part of why maybe I didn't talk to Becca as a member of her committee member about harassment before she entered the field was that my approach was much more along the lines of pushing it aside as surplus data. So we use that term that's actually Joan Fujimura's term that she uses in a different context to refer to the data that researchers set aside because they think it's irrelevant to their work. That was more my style. You know, if I was going to face harassment in the field, I was going to say, well, I'm not going back to that community, or I guess I'm not going to talk to that research participant anymore. And so I think that it became clear to us right away that we had had really different responses to harassment, which meant, I think, that there was something interesting to discover. So I guess we can leave it there and then hand it over to Sneha, who's going to ask another, like a follow-up to Brandon's question. Then we'll start answering those questions as well as ones in the Q&A. So if anybody else has questions they want to ask, please type them in the Q&A, please.
So, I really want to thank Brandon for the questions because I have been wrestling with this idea of, like, am I a sociologist? Am I an ethnographer? I identify mostly with the term ethnographer because I really just like sometimes feel like I speak to no sociologist. But what I realized when I was reading this book is that as much as I would like to write the way, you know, like this embodied reflexivity and embodied ethnography, I can't imagine publishing this stuff in popular journals that I need to publish in order to like make it, you know, in the world of sociology or whatever. So on the one hand, of course, there have to be changes in terms of training, but also in terms of what is considered legitimate, right? So if you take AJS or ASR or like social forces, it's hard to imagine this kind of writing making it there. It almost inevitably becomes like a gender and society piece or an ethnography piece, or you just end up publishing in like science or something else, like something that's not really sociology or something, you know, like you still stick to the margins. So I guess following up on what Brandon was saying, like, can we even imagine doing this work and staying within sociology, or do we have to like radically reimagine where this writing leads us? Because I want to do this kind of writing, I just don't know where to place myself while doing this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I really appreciate this question too, Brandon, and Becca, if it's okay with you, I'll start answering.
Yeah, go ahead.
Want to add? So it's interesting because this question about, are we like, why are we so invested, I guess, still in validity and ethnography and sociology? I think it's a really good question. And I do think like part of it is maybe unconscious, right? Like, because we're so mad at ethnography and sociology and the way that validity has been discussed, that we, that's where we sort of are aiming our darts. But I wonder then, as you seem to be wondering too, if by aiming our darts there, we are reifying their power somehow, and this was an issue that came up, I think, in my feminist research methods class this past semester too. In response to the ethnography readings in general, the students were actually asking, is it time to give up on this idea of ethnography and make something new? And so it's exciting to me that you're bringing up that same question. I love it. And I do, like, I'm also thinking that the current moment, right, especially with the latest explosion of Black Lives Matter protests, like also just really call upon us as scholars to like think about where our research and our teaching lies in this social and political scenario. Like, where are we allied? And if our disciplines and our methods are getting in the way of being allied on the side of what we want to be a part of, then we need to do away with them and make something new. So, Becca.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really fabulous question, and is something that, similarly, as Sneha was saying, as someone who really, I'm more so I think about myself as an ethnographer, and because I feel like I end up reading a lot more in a very interdisciplinary fashion. I mean, because I also teach at the Center for Latin American Studies, which is a very interdisciplinary place. I definitely feel like I've moved further away from sociology since my, with every year, which I think is a good thing. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the great things about the women that we interviewed is we didn't just talk to sociologists, right? We did have some anthropologists, we had ethnomusicologists. I think those are the two other fields that immediately come to mind. And so I think that clearly shows that this is an issue that's much broader and much larger than sociology, right? This is an issue that has more so to do with like an entire history and lineage of methods and the ways in which those are evaluated, right? So yeah, I think it's right to say that sociology isn't necessarily the only place that, as Patricia said, that we want to be aiming our darts. I would say that I think that doing ethnography in different ways, not even necessarily in the way that we talk about it, but in the way that like Ajahn talks about it with invading ethnography, is actually about destabilization, is about destabilizing these very linear narratives that we have about field research, right? I mean, I think when ethnography is done in ways that that kind of question itself as it's being written, or discuss the ways in which our presence somewhere for various reasons is disruptive of the field sites that we're in, and doesn't maybe create these like intimate relationships that Annie was talking about that are very important in some research sites that have kind of been overvalued in ethnographic writing as a discipline, or in various disciplines. So I think that I wouldn't necessarily say that I think like we need to be done with ethnography, I suppose, as a method, but we need to turn to other scholars who are writing about decolonizing ethnography, or are writing about anti-racist ethnography, in a way to think about how to utilize this method in a way that actually is incredibly disruptive of the way that we've thought about it for so long.
Well, yeah, and I think that that is really a part of, refusing to kind of accept, ethnography as it has come to be understood, to insist that it continue to be dynamic. And same thing, with sociology, because, we're also sociologists, and sociology is also ours. And so we can stake a claim to that too, and making it into something different.
And yeah, I'll just add one more thing, which is that I think, I believe that Patricia and I actually did have a conversation about whether or not we wanted to use the term validity in the book, because it is like way down by all of this horrible positivist history. Though I do think that when we look at like Ruth Behar's, like cite in the book, there, rather than thinking about validity as being able to say that we are showing some very specific or some generalizable truth about the social world, right? Or prove that our research is the truth. And the way that we're thinking about validity is actually just being, maybe we could just say that honest, being honest about the way in which research is done. And I think when we do that, that actually kind of like explodes the way in which we've talked about validity for a long period of time. If we're actually honest about what all these things that I know that Sneha is saying is so hard to include in our work, and we don't know how to do that yet. It's something that I'm still working on with my current book project as well. But I think that when we do that, we actually are fighting against or moving against that history of validity that you're incredibly right in critiquing and being worried about.
So, yeah. So we have some questions here.
Yeah. So I was going to say we have a bunch of questions, and I just wanted to acknowledge that we had almost 100 people participating. And I know we have a lot of graduate students and a lot of undergraduates who are just starting ethnographic research. So we're really excited to get to hear your questions. And I know people have been submitting them. So we will move to our question and answer portion. And I feel like, some are going to be directed to the authors, but I think, Brandon, Annie, Sneha, if you have comments to add too, I would really love to hear from you as well.
I realized we also meant to respond to Annie's observation at the end about resilience. And I think that is, that's a really, really important point. And I think, if anything, I think all of our participants in the study really show, through their willingness and enthusiasm in talking about the issues they face in the field, they do show that resilience and their desire to kind of be, use their anger and their frustration towards, towards productive change. I also wanted to mention another article written by a group of women of color anthropologists that's absolutely fabulous along these lines. The first author, it's a collective, it's a feminist collective actually out of UT Austin too, in their activist anthropology program. The first author on it is Maya Berry, and the article is called Towards Fugitive Anthropology, in which they kind of call out many of these similar issues and call for the, sort of shakedown of, in their case, activist anthropology in order to create something different and something better. Okay, so this first question is from Hilary Steinberg, and it reads, my dissertation, like many people's research, I think, has moved to virtual methods due to COVID-19. Are there ways you are thinking about gender and embodiment in virtual spaces? I think, this is such an important question, as I see basically all of my own students' work moving to virtual spaces right now too. Among our participants, who we interviewed for the book, there was one woman who was doing research on gaming. And she described the very awkward and awful experience of being harassed as an avatar. And so I think that, while we might think of online spaces being somehow more protective in some regards, I think that they're not in others. And so I guess I'll just say, like, I think that these conversations are still relevant to these spaces, but that maybe the harassment that will take place will look a little bit different. But, you know, in the case of this particular researcher, she gave up that project because it was such an overwhelming experience to her. She did not want to continue with it.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, I think, doing ethnography or interviews online is still interaction. And so as sociologists, not to but as sociologists, we know that interactions are constituted by gender and race and class and all of these things, right? So I think it's an interesting question of how honestly violence and sexual harassment will look different or might occur differently, or how danger might occur differently online. But it's, so I think that's maybe an open question for discussion, what that might look like, but that it's still obviously going to be constitutive of the interactions that you have online. On the other hand, I think about this push for intimacy and this like desire to feel close to the people that we're working with. And I wonder if all of the work that's going to be done online is going to kind of feed into that and make us even more vulnerable and open, unnecessarily vulnerable in some ways. So I'm thinking about one of the women that we interviewed who gave her number out to a couple of her research participants and ended up being like text messaged and harassed over the phone after doing that to kind of like build trust with her participants, right? So that's kind of like where my mind goes into, sorry?
Oh, I was just said several of our participants were stalked over the phone.
Yeah. So I guess I just say that to say, unfortunately, I think it's going to be a problem that will just manifest itself in different ways, and trying to think about how to navigate that and how to resist this like push for intimacy despite the separations that exist due to COVID and with technology is a question that I hope people will be able to navigate with their advisors or with other people who can support them.
Yeah.
The next two questions are about the notion of embodied ethnography and embodied reflexivity and what we mean by that. So I guess I can give just a kind of really quick definition or explanation of what we mean by that. So we obviously there are lots of different lineages, and we actually draw on a number of different bodies like of scholarship to think about embodiment, but more or less kind of like what we're talking about with the notion is a practice of reflecting on how our research process is structured by meanings that are attached to our body, both the meanings we attach to our bodies, but the meanings that our research participants attach to their own bodies, to our bodies, I'm sorry, and our identities and self-presentation in our field sites, and what the implications are for the knowledge that produces. So we're advocating for thinking about the ways in which embodiment structures our field site, as well as the data that we have access to and the way that we analyze it. This might be jumping a little bit off topic in terms of it's not about my field site, but I have been thinking about this a lot with my the book project that I'm finally wrapping up for my dissertation, which ended up, rather than being a 2-year ethnography, ended up being a 6-year project because I ended up going back to Venezuela to do follow-up research starting in 2017. But the reason that happened is because I was literally too traumatized to go back and read and analyze my data from my dissertation research for a number of years. And so the project kind of just, its life got extended kind of on its own. So I was thinking, when I'm writing about this in the book, I could create this very nice narrative about how I'm so dedicated to long-term research. This is why the book took as long as it did. But in considering the actual story and narrative of how this book has taken as long as it has, being honest about kind of what brought me to work on the project for so long is, I think, both more honest and has everything to do with the ways in which my body was interpreted in the field. So the entire book itself is structured by the embodied interactions that I had while I was conducting research.
Mm-hmm. Great. Do you want to say anything else about embodied, or do you want to move on to?
No, unless you want to add something to it.
No, I think you answered that very nicely.
unless some of the panelists, I don't know if any of the panelists want to respond to some of the questions, maybe?
Or not.
I mean, I would love to see you respond to the next question.
Yeah. So the next question is, how do we get male academics or men academics to read this text? Who do we direct our grievances to? The gatekeepers. And so like this is such a good question. I think Becca and I talked about this a lot over the course of writing the book, and we've had some obviously men aren't a monolith either, and they we've had some men respond really positively to it, and some men respond with a lot of doubt about the legitimacy of what we were saying. And so how do we get them to read it? Well, we assign it in our methods classes. No, but we do, make them read it. But I think also one of the big points we make, and we also interviewed, I think, 7 men. Is that right, Becca?
Yeah,
so
I think 7.
Our interview participants were 7 men. I think we try to make the point over and over that it's not that just women face issues with embodiment in the field. It's just that they are so that harassment and violence often become so sort of present in women's experiences that they are impossible to ignore. And because women remain the other in in sort of how we imagine this kind of neutral ethnographer, that means it's always going to be the people who are not elite white straight cis men who are going to have to kind of justify their different experiences in the field. But that doesn't mean that men also aren't having embodied experiences in the field. And so we make that point. Does that mean they'll read the book? I don't know, only if we assign it, probably. But I think where do we direct our grievances to? I mean, sometimes I think like, okay, so the book is a grievance in a way, but I think in our conclusion, part of what we also want to say is, okay, like we collectively have a responsibility to change this. And so I think like sometimes it's like, okay, this is what we think, here's our grievance, but now we're gonna claim our own space and we're gonna make the change. And that is easier said than done, right? When you don't necessarily hold the power, but power structures are also changing. So
I just wanted to insert too, I thought a lot about that in terms of, the power that we do have is that we review journal articles, right? Like we can be on boards of journals and things like that. But, at the same time that, in some ways it's depressing to think that you had to write this book because we still are talking about this and, there still aren't sort of recognition or, I wouldn't say solutions, but, the fact that like this book has to continually be written and continually be justified, right? And that the turn towards so-called carnal ethnography really wasn't about like these kinds of issues, right? It was like, what could you put your body through in order to show that you were like the toughest person ever, right? And, I know Kimberly Hong is on here, so Kimberly might have something to add about this, and she's written really eloquently about these critiques of carnal ethnography. Mm-hmm. But, it's so striking to me that the conversations that I am in about ethnography are conversations like this, but then also, this completely other conversation that's going on about how to make ethnography more valid, right? In terms of you have to unmask your field sites and you have to, share your field notes and all this kind of thing. And, that has taken on this weird kind of macho valence that I really don't understand. Like when like sharing data has become like a macho thing, I don't quite get that, right? But it's just these conversations about like, ethnographers are out, we're going to prove to you that we really saw the things that we saw, and like you can go to that same place and you can see it too, and I'm going to name people and I'm going to name companies. And I think these things are so at odds because if you're writing about sexual harassment, like you feel even more pressure not to name people, right? I mean, like, even if you're being sexually harassed, you understand you're at the mercy of these people to like let you into this project in order to, you know, get a job, to get a publication, to do all these kinds of things. And I just think, you know, it's so funny that those conversations are about like the brave ethnographer is the one who unmasks everything. And, you know, I don't know. I just think it's interesting to think of these two things happening in our discipline in ethnography at the same time and thinking like, what is going on with that? So that was just my.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I just wanted to add one thing really quickly to that, which is that it actually makes a lot of sense to me, this weird, like, macho approach to validity, which is basically that, like, let me show you in even more excruciating detail all of the things that I like put myself through when I was doing my research. Like, give me even more space to let me tell you about all of the hardships that I was able to overcome.
And the thing that drives me crazy is that it doesn't work for people who identify as women a lot of times. You know, so I think of Catherine Frank, who wrote this great ethnography about men who identify as strip club regulars. And, you know, the fact that she writes in there that she actually faced an enormous amount of stigma because she was a dancer, right? And that like it didn't translate. I mean, that's as carnal as you could get. And it didn't translate into people being like, wow, you really put your body on the line. It translated into people being like, oh, you know, that woman was
exactly. So like, yeah, so the rewards of doing that aren't distributed equally. And in addition, that, you know, model, that idea that you can reveal your field sites and everything about them and share data, and that means that somebody else can replicate your study, is totally wrong, because we are embodied scholars, and our embodiment and what it signifies socially is not the same. It's not going to result in the same work. So this idea that you know, they need to reveal everything to make it somehow more positivist and valid is, I think, based on really, really faulty assumptions.
But also,
yeah, I think, no, go ahead.
If I could just add, I feel like a lot of this conversation around what you must reveal, the center of all of it is that it's not on your terms. Like, it's not on my terms. Like, I'll have to reveal what the gatekeepers want me to reveal, which is make transparent certain things, but I'm also not allowed to write about my feelings, for instance, you know, like, because that's not somehow data. So just this impulse to like what you reveal and what you don't reveal is also somehow out of the hands of women ethnographers or marginalized ethnographers in the field to begin with.
Yeah, I think it's also just really interesting to think about it in terms of like I think the push towards showing all of our data and being more transparent, or whatever the whole discussion, whatever terms are being used in the discussion, it's really about clarify. Like, there's an idea that this is going to clarify things for people, and there's an assumption there that, and I mentioned this already, but you know, Ajahang's work in Vetting Ethnography, I think, does a really good job of saying, like, well, what happens when our presence in a place actually causes confusion for the people that we work with, and what happens when that brings up more questions for people, or than clarifying it. So I think that there's an interesting, it's just strange to think that because we're providing more information and more and more data or something like this, right, that's going to lead to some kind of like clarification that's needed, as opposed to considering and being aware of the fact that our presence in lots of places, in lots of spaces, and then in their work, the non-binary issue, the recognition that there's so much confusion that comes up, and that has to be navigated in field work, that again is something that's just not really, because we're supposed to be becoming experts as we're becoming ethnographers. We're supposed to be becoming like better at showing people things. And so I think that whole narrative of doing field work kind of just pushes aside all of these like questions, like confusion that arises as you're doing your research with people in the field.
Great. Should we move on to our next question?
Sure. So the next one is from Karlin Gorski. How can researchers weigh the benefits of engaging with harassment directly in their work with the discomfort of having that obligation placed upon them due to interactions they never asked to have? I think this is a really important question that really gets to, you know, the costs not only of harassment, right, but the ways that you know, that those costs then can end up perhaps being compounded by the approach that we seem to be advocating. And I guess one thing that I would just start by saying is that I think that, you know, each individual researcher has the right to weigh those costs for themselves. And they have the right to decide what they want to reveal to whom in whatever context. So I'll just sort of start with that. And Becca, if you have something else you want to add.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this, Annie, when you were talking about, you know, this this desire, like, well, I don't want to like cut this population out of my research because I want to like get this data. And I think that it's important to ask yourself, why am I why do I continue to include this population in my research? Is it because, and of course these desires are difficult to to kind of tease out, but are you, as long as it's not because you feel like you have to do it because your committee expects you to do it, or you're doing it because you feel like you have to do it in order to be able to be published. I mean, I continue to work with police officers in Venezuela, and I continued to do that during my dissertation research. I did look for different ways in which to engage in research that reduced harassment, but I am aware of the fact that every time I work on those types of projects, that harassment is something that's going to happen. So I think that kind of like what Patricia is saying, the important thing is for us to be aware of the fact that we have various options in terms of the projects that we can produce, that we can change those if need be, that you have sources of support if you continue to work with populations that you know are going to objectify you or require sexualization. Thinking about the ways in which to build support while you do those projects, I think is really important. So it's not necessarily about us saying like certain people shouldn't be doing research projects. I think it's more so just thinking about the variety of ways that research actually gets done and being honest about that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I initially read that question as being more about like feeling obligated than by what we're calling for in the book to write about it, which then when I reread the question, it wasn't about that. And so, yeah, I'll just reiterate that I think that the main, you know, one of the things that Becca and I were really surprised by in our findings was how many of our participants had abandoned their project and decided to do something else because the costs were too high. And to recognize that that's an okay option, but then also the other part that was maybe more expected was that almost everyone in the sample, if they didn't abandon their project, they modified it in some way so that it was sustainable for them to still do the project, and to recognize again that that is an acceptable thing to do. And I think like for whatever reason, even though people modify projects all the time for a whole host of reasons, and modifying is part of what makes good ethnographic project on the ground, there was something about the experiences of harassment in the field that sort of paralyzed people for a while and made them feel like they weren't good ethnographers if they didn't have the mettle to just put up with it.
And I do think too that as faculty we have to think like a lot of times faculty convey that to students, whether directly or indirectly. You know, I mean, I certainly saw that when I was in grad school, like, you know, people I went to grad school with being told by ethnographers, like, well, you should just tough it out. Like other people could tough it out, or a real ethnographer would be able to put up with this. And, you know, people directly say that. And so I think that, you know, it's something to think about in terms of, you know, how faculty teach and how they mentor, right? And even if we're not the people doing it, to be able to push back if there is someone on the committee who keeps saying, I know, but if you just really tried, you could, you know, do this thing, and really be able to say like, no, like you shouldn't have to, right?
Yeah, and I think that goes, I mean, in terms of thinking about training, it just goes like the ethnographies and the qualitative research that we're assigning to people. Like, what does that suggest to students that they need to be doing to get their research done? Are we, I mean, remember reading like James Scott, a lot of James Scott's work, who's of course a brilliant researcher, but much later on reading an interview with him where he talked about he never lived in any of the villages where he conducted research because he realized that that was too, but he never says that in any of his work, right? Like we don't know that he's not like, with them all of the time. So I think just like thinking about the books that we assign to people and what that communicates to our students about what they have to do like quote unquote good research is important.
Yeah. So I think we should we'll answer the next two questions and then we'll wrap up. And I will say if your question didn't get answered, all of the panelists are happy to talk to you offline. So you can send emails and, and hopefully I think we've answered a lot of them sort of tangentially through this, but let's do the next two and then we'll end.
Sounds good. So who wants to read this one?
I can go for it. It's okay. So I guess it's a little bit long. This is from Dipali. Hi, thank you so much for the book. It has redefined my thinking about fieldwork and ethnography. My question is around the false divide between an ethnographic account and dissertation and a field diary. How do we write about ourselves and our positionality without decentering the subject matter? I'm getting my PhD in international relations, and I've been repeatedly told that I'm only talking about quote unquote feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talk about disciplinarity. I have started recommending to my students that they don't have a separate journal. This, the idea of having an ethnographic, like a journal or a place where you write your ethnographic field notes and then a place where you kind of have a field diary and that those are somehow distinct items never really worked for me in the field anyway. And I think I advise to have them be the same thing. That said, that doesn't help you deal with this assertion on the part of others that you're only talking about your feelings. And I say, like, in part, you arm yourself with good ethnographic work that does, involve accounts of feelings, like Annie's work that she just talked about, like writing about her feelings in her field notes actually ended up being a whole chapter of her dissertation, so so I think, if you're getting this from your committee or whatever, you provide them with the evidence that they are behind the times. So there. Anyway, Becca, what do you want to say?
No, I think the issue of writing, of having these two different journals just really reproduces so many of the issues that we critique in the book, and was something that I ended up, so in one of the chapters of the book, we show just a very brief ethnographic vignette from what was my original dissertation, and then when I had gone back and written it in an embodied fashion, which meant that I had to go to my Vitting journal that I had kept while I was doing my dissertation and kind of reintegrate that information into the quote unquote like neutral ethnographic vignette that I had written, and seeing those two side by side, it makes it very clear what's lost in the version, the like cleansed version, I don't know, the purified version of the ethnographic vignette or whatever. So yeah, I think there's so much more that we understand. And I have talked about this with a couple of students. I do think there's an argument to be made, and you're the one that has to make it, as Patricia is saying, but that we actually learn so much more about what we're studying when we include these like, quote unquote feelings, when we include our subjectivity and our subjective experiences. I think we have to make a case for the fact that this is actually important for evaluating knowledge and for understanding our field sites. I mean, I think that is potentially a place in which we can make a scholarly acceptable argument for this, though, that this has everything to do with the knowledge, the way in which we understand the work that we're producing, the way in which we understand our field sites. So it's actually an absolutely necessary part of what we're writing about. It's not something that's just additional or added on.
Can I jump into this one? Just
Yes,
because
please.
the person's in international relations. So like some of my like favorite literature is based in emotions and political economy, which is really trying to make a dent into this very masculinized international relations globalization literature. So Cynthia Enloe for me is sort of like where I start with that. And when I was thinking through my own like emotions on the data, I think for me it became a question of, it's not just my feelings, but that feelings has an analytical point to this story. My own way of doing my dissertation was that I had an appendix, which was more all about me, but then I made a decision to only put myself in, and actually some of you might disagree with this, but I decided I only put myself in where I'm analytically relevant to the chapter. And that actually, in some ways, maybe is accommodationist, but it justified me being in there, because if my feelings of fear and anxiety or whatever, what that actually did was it was showing how this space could not necessarily be commodified instantly if we're talking about tourism. That has implications for the nation state then about how a nation state sees itself as safe or not safe. So I don't know the particulars of your project, but if you have those emotions and feelings, I think the question you should ask is, what is this really analytically showing in the context of the nation, in the context of this locality that I'm doing fieldwork in? And that can maybe help you develop it a bit.
Yeah, that is so well put.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. That's a really important.
Like this is something Becca and I have been talking about is, I don't think that either of us wants to argue that like you put yourself in every single, story from the field that you tell. It's, it's asking yourself, where is it relevant, and if it is relevant, then it needs to go in. I mean, if you want it to go in. See, now I'm talking myself down back down into the point, about making sure that it is ultimately, up to you also as an individual. Okay, so we have one more question that we're answering today. Again, we are happy to answer any other questions, and this is from Anima at Japan. We're so happy you are here since we've been mentioning your work a couple of times already. So she writes, thank you for the interesting responses on this book. I can't wait to read it. I'm curious to hear from the authors how their reflections and discussions of gender/embodiment in fieldwork might extend how we think about gender beyond binaries in doing fieldwork. I ask this as a non-binary researcher who has navigated interlocutors' anxieties about not being able to gender me, how that gender ambiguity brings about its own concerns about doing the work, and how does this liminality perhaps reorient how we engage with embodied approaches to qualitative research, not just ethnography. Becca, do you want to speak first on this one?
Yeah, I can get started on. I think this is such a fantastic question, and I feel like it's one that I need to be able to like think about for so long to provide a decent response or an informed response. I mean, I will say, I think one of the, and Patricia and I have talked about this, one of the things that we wish that we had more time, that we could have done more with the book and have thought about doing in the future is having more voices from trans and non-binary researchers, because I do think that there's a whole area of experiences that the book does not speak to because of that. And we did interview one trans researcher that was incredibly, I did the interview. It was a wonderful interview in terms of thinking even more from an intersectional perspective. But I do think that is kind of in terms of like reflecting on what I think we could have done different with the book, or maybe better with the book is think about these types of questions a little bit more. I mean, I think what I would say is to kind of maybe go back to what I was talking about before with confusion, is I think that it's also about like not letting like people whose bodies are considered to be like these neutral instruments or whatever get away with the narrative that their bodies are also did not produce this confusion and these problems in their field sites, probably for other reasons. But I think part of it is really challenging, for example, white cisgender men about not talking about the barriers that that are produced in their research sites because of their bodies, and not allowing for them to provide such smooth, linear narratives about their fieldwork. So I think in certain ways it's about challenging kind of the hegemonic narrative that we talk about in the book, and not letting certain researchers say that they just kind of fell into their research site, developed these wonderful relationships, and came out with all of this amazing data, and that's the end of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, in the case of the one trans respondent who we did have, you know, among our sample, the you know, this issue of the ambiguities of people knowing or not knowing did really enter into their field research in ways that you know, ended up being very threatening in their case. And I know, Anima, that, you know, you've obviously also written about this in that Invading Ethnography article, somewhat, that you know, that kind of navigating those anxieties, you know, while, you know, perhaps sometimes they are linked to violence, other times they may just be linked to access. And then, you know, you're navigating, you know, how you present to those people. And maybe sometimes in some contexts for the better, right? Like you figure out how, you know, how to dress, or you go with their assumptions about you, and you make that, you know, you try to make that work for you. But I think like whether it ends up having a positive impact or a negative impact, it does result, I think, in more work and different work than ever really gets addressed or considered, you know, when we're talking about power in the field in our methods classes.
Great. Do any other panelists want to add any last words or insight? Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate, again, all of you doing this in the summer. I'm so happy we were able to have the book salon for this book, and I just really value all the input from Sneha and Brandon and Annie, and, you know, want to thank Patricia and Rebecca for producing this book. You know, this was really a great session, and I think it was really helpful to a lot of the people who were on, and certainly very helpful to me. So I just want to thank you all.
Well, and thank you, Kristen and Sneha, for organizing, and again, Brandon and Annie, for your comments and your thoughtful reading of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. There really are not words to suffice to thank you all for everything.
Thank you. And again, if you have other questions, please feel free to reach out to the panelists via email, and they're happy to talk with you about your work or your questions that you might have. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.